So with our recording started, I want to officially welcome everyone and introduce myself. I'm Sarah Salteen. I'm the Director of Leadership and Learning Programs at the Center for Partnership Studies. And I'm honored to welcome you on behalf of the Center to this webinar called Power With and Power Through: How Women Are Leading Differently for a Just and Caring World. Before we get much further today, we want to start by expressing our gratitude to our co-sponsoring organizations who helped us to get the word out about this event and are, of course, supporting the broader interests of this work. And those co-sponsors include Feminist Press, Omega Women's Leadership Center, Take the Lead, the Caring Economy Campaign, the Charter for Compassion, 9 Muses, Reclaiming the Wise Woman Elder, Quantum Negotiation, the Sister Fund, the Network of Spiritual Progressives, and Tikkun Magazine. Thank you all so much for your support of this endeavor and this event. And I want to, of course, also thank you, those of you who are attending live today, and those who are joining us later in time by replay. It's really exciting to have you with us for this important conversation and timely conversation about gender, power, and leadership. As we set the stage for our conversation today, I think it makes sense to begin by acknowledging that we come together today at an extraordinary moment in history. A moment when we see these themes of gender and power and leadership played out vividly, painfully, and inescapably in our daily news. A moment when we're witnessing and co-authoring a profound renegotiation of which voices get to speak, which values are recognized as valid, who gets to lead us forward, and what forms that leadership will take. It seems, doesn't it, that we're collectively engaged in a process of sort of pulling back the veneer on ways of organizing and enacting power that have held sway for too long and at great cost. And as we do, some key dynamics of how that power operates are becoming visible to more of us, and perhaps more vividly than ever before. We can see plainly how power over hierarchies of patriarchal power are maintained in part through a regime that combines sexualized violence with active silencing of the voices of the abused. And at the same time, from a different angle, we're beginning to see that our binary notion of gender itself is a social construct that has helped support and maintain these systems of power. Notions of gender fluidity and non-binary ways of performing gender are giving us ways to think about and occupy our gendered bodies and identities in new and more complex ways. And thirdly, as we seek to work together to forge a different kind of world, grounded in life-giving values of mutuality, caring, nonviolence, responsibility, and justice, we're called to also reckon with the fact that gender is not the only relevant difference that is used to establish hierarchies of power, privilege, and entitlement. Race, sexual orientation, immigration status, religion, class, all of these vectors of power and identity intersect in our experiences and our histories and position us differently as subjects of power over and as agents of change. It is a complex landscape and that can feel enraging, confusing, and hopeful. Many of us are wondering, how did we get here? And what will it take to move us somewhere profoundly better? Our three panelists today are exceptionally well positioned to help us make sense of what we're seeing in our world and to help us weave new narratives of possibility for leading differently in pursuit of a more just and caring world. And I'm honored to introduce them to you now. Rion Eisler is president of the Center for Partnership Studies and is internationally known as a systems scientist, an attorney pioneering the human rights of women and children, and author of the bestseller, The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, which is now in 26 foreign editions and 56 US printings. As an early feminist leader, she co-founded the first Women's Center on the West Coast, wrote a brief to the US Supreme Court, making the then radical argument that women should be considered persons under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and helped change discriminatory laws, such as rape laws, that put the victim on trial. Her many books include The Equal Rights Handbook, Sacred Pleasure, Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body, and The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics. Dr. Eisler lectures worldwide and is co-founder of the Caring Economy Campaign, the Spiritual Alliance to Stop Intimate Violence, or SAVE, and is editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, which is an online peer-reviewed journal housed at the University of Minnesota that was inspired by Eisler's work. We are also honored to be joined today by Jamia Wilson, who is many things, an activist, a feminist, a storyteller, a movement builder, a media maker, and a natural-born thought leader. She is executive director and publisher of Feminist Press at City University of New York. She is the former Women Action in the Media executive director, a TED Prize storyteller, and former vice president of programs at the Women's Media Center. Jamia has been a powerful voice in the social justice movement for nearly a decade. And as a leading voice on feminist and women's rights issues, her work and words have appeared in and on several outlets, such as New York Magazine, The Today Show, and The Washington Post. She's also a staff writer for Rookie and has contributed to several books such as Madonna and Me, Women Writers on the Queen of Pop, and with great resonance, I Still Believe Anita Hill. But what we're most excited about is her own book that she's currently writing about Beyonce and feminism. It's no surprise she was named in Refinery 29's 17 Faces of the Future of Feminism. So welcome, Jamia. And we also are joined by Carla Goldstein, a pioneer in women's leadership with 25 years of public policy experience on issues related to women's rights, poverty, sustainability, and social justice. Carla serves as Omega Institute's Chief External Affairs Officer, where she helps Omega connect its work to change-making efforts around the world. Omega is which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, is the nation's premier holistic learning center, where they offer innovative educational experiences to over 23,000 people annually and reach over 2 million people online. Carla is also co-founder of the Omega Women's Leadership Center, a hub for convening, inspiring, and training women to do power differently. So we thought we would begin today with a few prepared questions to bring our panelists into the conversation and to sort of set the stage for the broader conversation that we'd like to have with all of you who are joining us today. So as you listen in this first part, please do be thinking about the kinds of questions, topics, themes, comments that you'd like to bring forward, and we'll take the second portion of our time together today to bring forward your questions and invite our panelists to speak to the issues that are top of mind for you. So I want to begin It's just lovely to see all of your faces arrayed here. And I want to begin by inviting us to sort of put the events of the day, which are so weighing so heavily on so many of our minds and hearts, in a broader context. And we're talking much broader. We have the great gift of having a macro historian in our midst, Rian Eisler. Your work gives us the gift of being able to sort of locate our current moment in the context of at least a 10,000 year sweep of human history all the way back to prehistorical times. When we zoom out like that, what kinds of dynamics does your work help us see? Are the gendered systems of power that we're seeing so clearly now and that seem in some ways so normal and inevitable, are they? Are they normal and inevitable? Are they the only possibility? What does your work help us see that sets the stage for a bigger vision?
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody, and thank you for all these wonderful panelists we have here. I'm glad you posed that question, because what we've been told, of course, is that the male supremacy, violence, inequity, that's just, quote, human nature. And it's part of a narrative that supports what my research over 3 decades, more than 3 decades now, has identified as a domination system, rather than what I've also identified as a partnership-oriented system. No society is completely one or the other configuration. But what we really see is that this is a lie, plain and simple. The evidence is so powerful that for most of human cultural evolution, not only were women and men basically in a balanced and more egalitarian relationship, but that this went along with a way of structuring all of society. Because if you really think about it, if you look at how women and men are supposed to be, how they're defined, whether one half is silence of our humanity and the other one is supposed to dominate, that's a model, isn't it? As for all kinds of discrimination, be it racial, religious, etc. What we find is that this went along actually with a more equitable society and with a society that did not have war, contrary to what we have been told. And in my book, The Chalice and the Blade and Sacred Pleasure, this is documented. And in the new book that I have now, that will be out next year, which is coming rather soon, we really go even further back than the prehistoric societies that I looked at to the first foraging societies millennia back. And we see the same pattern. So what we really see is what I've called a 5,000-year detour, a domination system. But 5,000 years is a long time. In terms of the silencing of women. It was a time during which, for example, modern science emerged out of a clerical, misogynist culture in medieval times, a world without women or children. Think about that for a moment. How did that influence the narrative that we are receiving even from science? Not to speak of the popular narrative. Now that really leads directly to this matter of women's leadership. Of course, in what I call a domination system, that's an oxymoron, right? I mean, women are not to lead. But in terms of the imagery that we have from prehistory, in terms of what's happening today is really not radical or new. It is rooted, deeply rooted in our past. And it is essential now, and this is where I really want to go. We need to not just work for a bigger piece of the existing pie, but, to use a woman's metaphor, to bake a better pie. And this is what my work, the work of Carla, the work of Jamia, the work of the center is about. And women's leadership, women's status is not, quote, just a women's issue. This is one of the key findings from my work. It is a core social issue. And I want to wind up with that because we have been used to all of our institutions, economics, politics, family, religion, even though religion talks in terms of partnership values, in reality, institutionalized religion has been a major, really supporter of domination systems. We are used to really thinking that power is power over, right? The power to dominate, the power to really destroy, the chalice or the blade, the power of the blade. And this has been falsely equated with, quote, real masculinity. And real masculinity has been equated with not being soft, feminine, quote, like a woman. So we have to understand that we have had a gendered system of values which devalues precisely those traits and activities that today are essential not only for us to thrive as humans, but to survive. The old domination system mixed with high technology guided, if high technology is guided by an ethos of domination, we have no future. And yes, redefining gender roles and relations. And women, this is key. This is key. It's one of the key elements of cultural transformation that is so urgently needed towards the partnership side of the continuum. And I want to say that when I speak of women's leadership, I am not speaking of matriarchy versus patriarchy. I mean, we're talking about partnership versus domination. And we're also talking about working with enlightened men and changing really that whole question of what is power, what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be human? And it's up to us. And what's so exciting about this time is that we are making our voices heard, over talked sometimes, as we saw so vividly on television in the Supreme Court hearings, at times by a loud, angry male voice, but we are making our voices heard. And I entreat you, I urge you, make your voices heard.
Thank you so much, Rian. That's such important context for this conversation. I wonder, Carla, if you might speak to, as the co-founder of the Omega's Women's Leadership Center, you're sort of centrally focused on these issues of doing power differently. And I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about the conversations or how you've grappled with the complexities of what women's leadership means. Why does the phrase women's leadership still feel so necessary, important in a moment where there's some reconsideration of sort of the centrality of gender binaries and those kinds of concerns?
Thank you. And it's an honor to be with all of you today, Rian. Listening to you is always so uplifting and helpful. I want to add, before I answer that question about what do we hear women talking about and grappling with, I want to add a little bit more to context, because I think that's a piece of the puzzle. We're all sort of, trying to figure out that question of how we got here and why is it feel so hard and so complex and so confusing. And so I love, Rianne, how you scope back the 10,000 years. And one of the things I think it's important to mark about the transition, so what happened over those 10,000 years? What was the transition from these egalitarian societies, or more or less more egalitarian societies, to a dominance model? What was the trigger? And historians have studied this, Rianne has studied this, but I think one of the consensus triggers was the moving to an agricultural society, that the way we got our food, when we used to forage for our food, was very hard to carry your possessions with you. The idea of hoarding and accumulating possessions was not an idea, because what are you going to do? You're going to carry your big log on your back to the next place you're going? No. So once we made this transition to agriculture, one of the things that became very important was controlling land. And the very concept of property, of something that we could own, came into being. And once you own land, you need to work land. And who were the primary workers of the land? Women and children were the primary workers of the land. And this is really, you see slavery. Women were some of the earliest slaves in the context of the origination of agriculture. And as people settled down, because now we own land, and what happens when you own land? You pass land on. So when you suddenly have to think about heirs, so then you need to start controlling women's sexuality. So bit by bit, the idea that one set of people would own and control another set of people accelerated during this, let's call it several thousand year period. And the other result of settling down was that civilization came into being. What do I mean by that? We had to come up with rules and laws. How are we going to operate? When you're roaming around, you don't need to worry about a traffic jam. But all of a sudden, when people are gathering around rivers and streams and staying there, you need rules of order. And when the rules of order were written into the law and our institutions were being built, economies were being structured, literally the idea that women were inferior beings, not of their own legal status or economic status, it was written into the law. And so you have several thousand years of that. And this thing that Rianne was talking about, like, it's just it's nature, right? The subordination of women, it's a nature, or it's by God. It's intrinsic. The idea that it's intrinsic seems so obvious because our lifespans are so short. So this, several thousand years later, you observe with each generation that women don't have their own say or their own voice. You conclude this just must be the way it is. And it's really relatively recent, 100, 200 years ago, that we have enough women speaking out. I mean, women have always been revolutionary in a sense, but you have enough women coming forward that we had the women's movement and several waves of the women's movement. And now you have the intersectional movements coming together. So I think it's important to understand how recent this idea is that we can own and claim our own voices. And the reason I say that as a foundation for what are women talking about when it comes to leadership is what we find is this gap, lots of gaps that need closing. Because primarily women have had an adaptive relationship to power. They this is what human beings do as social animals. We adapt to our circumstances. So we're trying, in the context of the work we're doing, we're trying to help women as they gain more power. As Rianne says, we don't want a bigger piece of the same pie. How do we bake a different pie? To change the relationship to power from an adaptive relationship to a transformative relationship. How do we not mimic the leadership model we have grown up watching and being alert to? How do we use power as a force for cooperation and collaboration? And what we have learned and know is that this will not happen simply because we have the anatomy of what we now say is a woman, right? We know that it comes from a set of experiences and value set that one is going to put into motion as one leads. And so this is what the authenticity gap is, what arises from an adaptive relationship to power. If you see, as you look around you, oh, I have to adapt to this circumstance, you know, let's call it back in the 70s where everybody wore shoulder pads. I have to look very masculine in order to hold a leadership seat. That's an adaptive response, right? I have to talk in a certain way or not talk. I'm at a table and I'm the only one, so I'm going to talk less. That's an adaptive response. So as what happens under those circumstances is inauthenticity. We're not saying what we really think. We're not expressing ourselves in the way we really want to express ourselves. And so how could we transform everything if we're just mimicking what we see? So this is the big work that we're doing with women, is to try to help women identify, validate, uplift their own authentic sense of what is right, and help build the kinds of skills that will allow for bringing those into families, communities, workplaces, legislatures, Supreme Courts.
Mm-hmm. And thank you so much. We're going to talk more about exactly what we mean by, or what those skills look like. But let's talk a little with Jamia first. And Jamia, feel free to chime in on this context in whatever way feels right. But I'd also like to invite you really as someone who's sort of as an activist and a movement builder, and really trying to think about advocacy. You have a lot of experience weaving narratives about social justice that help to sort of interrupt the more simplistic or binary ways of thinking about power that we may have inherited. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about some things you've learned about ways to sort of move people, even while holding the more complex new stories, or ways that build energy for change rather than shutting people down when they're invited to see things in this, through this different lens.
So thank you so much for having me on. Really honored to be with this amazing group of women, and also at the Feminist Press. We are big fans of Rianne. She was an honoree at our gala last year, and we just had our gala last night. So it feels like a full circle to think about the connectivity and partnership, right, that we all share and staying connected. And I think with the reason why we do literary activism, since we're talking about just the story, right, the story of power, our narratives, is because we really understand that culture shapes our minds, our understanding of who we are, our understanding of each other, our understanding of the potential we have, the potential others have, and then alternately shape the ways in which we develop biases about other people and their relationship to power, et cetera. And so this work is really important to us because we are actively engaging with the reality of understanding that truth is not truth if it doesn't include all of our voices. Yet we're in a media cycle where we are told a version of the truth, or not truth, actually. You hear the conversations about the so-called post-truth era that we're in, and what does that really mean? But the truth is that there are many different paths to truth, and there are many experiences that we all share that are a part of the whole human story. The reason I come to the work is specifically about the very ancient old idea, which is Ubuntu. It came from Southern Africa, an idea that's as old as humanity. I am because you are, because we are. And the work that we do around storytelling is really about that idea. We are the Feminist Press because in 1970, Florence Howe had an idea that there were lost works that were not being taught in the graduate school classes that she had, that she saw that even as a woman who was teaching, that the books that most of her students had read, or the ones that they were teaching in curriculum, were mostly written by men. But she knew that there were other stories to be told, and the stories of women's lives, especially at that time in 1970, thinking about what the social story was in the world. And what would it look like if those stories were unearthed and also lifted up? Then She also understood at that time that the press would be called the feminist press, because not all feminist people who believe in equality or the social, economic, cultural, and political equality of people of all genders, and I also say all races, that didn't just include people who are women. So that is the reason why we are the feminist press. And I have thanked Florence for that in our work together, because she's still on our board and she'll be 90 next year, and very active in the work that we do, for giving us the gift of the feminist press model that was built on inclusivity, built on partnership, built on the understanding that feminism is not just about women and people who are born cisgendered women, that this idea of feminism is something that is bigger than that, that it's global. It's not just US domestic gender equality movements, that it's movements that all of the feminisms that we hold are about a variety of viewpoints. And even a step further, we don't prescribe a specific way of understanding what feminism is. So you will have books. So, and behind me, there's a bookshelf of every single book that the feminist press has ever produced. And so it's a much bigger bookshelf than what you can see right now. And in that bookshelf, you will see books that do not always agree with each other, that provide different approaches to what feminism is from different perspectives. But we believe that they're all important. And so as literary activists, we give them all space and support to be in conversation about how we can change the narrative of what power is, the narrative of what equality is, with the understanding that, yes, we might have different pathways to get there, but the truth is somewhere in the nuanced complexity of all of those truths. And we don't feel like we need to silence a particular perspective. I will say, if there are perspectives that we do believe are domination focused, masked as partnership focused, those will not find a place here. But we do have books that sometimes will have content in them that make my personal ideological perspectives uncomfortable. You know, there's a book we have right now that's one of my favorite books here that has a chapter in it that is completely opposed to the way that I see reproductive justice. But I do respect the editor's very, very strong belief that it should be included, because the arguments in that article were based on a human rights partnership framework. And I also believe that I can disagree with a particular methodology of approach of how to fix a social problem, but still honor and respect the voices and experiences of communities that might see it differently from myself. And so I think that that's a big part of what we're trying to do in the narrative shifting, a big part of how we're seeing the work, and specifically around upholding the fact that we do believe that the voices of women and other marginalized people matter, that those voices are truth. Just even going against the idea of domination, that we should have to ask for permission to be included in a canon that left us out, that we will disrupt by uplifting, by shining a light on. Last night at the gala, the last thing I just wanted to share was that I really kept thinking about, okay, what can I say? We had a really, really rough week last week with everything that was going on in terms of the Senate hearings and just all of the division and friction that we could all feel very palpably. And I thought, what do we say to all of the people in this room who I know care so much about this issue? And also, you know, we published the I Still Believe Anita Hill book, so there was a lot of feelings about that. And I just decided to go to the words of Mariel Ruckhiser, who was also one of Feminist Press's authors. And she said, what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split right open. And it just felt really important to say those words, because I think that when I think of a partnership model, it's really about creating a world where all of us can safely and boldly, in community and collaboration, tell the truth about our lives and what it means to be in community and to be able to create transformation and honor through those collective truths. We can't tell the truth about our lives in a domination structure without severe consequences. We can't tell the truth about our lives, therefore stifling ourselves. And I'll take it a step further. One of our speakers last night said that the alarming rates of women having autoimmune diseases, of which I have, could be directly connected to the suppression of truth. And so I just feel that the work we do is so important, because I think that it has both activist, social, cultural, and spiritual import personally. It's not a part of our mission statement, but a very big part of what I believe is needed for transformation, and why I'm so excited that we're having this conversation.
Thanks so much, Jamia. You know, I wanted to offer one other sort of question for all of you that builds, I think, really beautifully on what Jamia says, and actually comes from a question that came to us from a woman named Marta in Spain, who couldn't be with us for the live webinar, but wanted to be sure to have her question on the table. And I think it really gets to this question of, if there's something, as Jamia is saying, if women's leadership is directly connected to truth-telling, and Carla, you talked about that as well, and is connected to doing power differently from that place of truth or authenticity, as you used the word, Carla. And there's so much to say on this, but I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit about your thoughts on Marta's question, which is, she says, I want to support women's empowerment in the future. She's sort of saying in the as she moves into her future, but also our future. And one of my visions is to be able to teach women about a partnership way of leading. And so this is obviously the work all of you are engaged in, both the teaching part, but perhaps also just the honoring the existing ways of leading. She says, a new feminine way where we can do things differently. So I wonder if each of you might just say a little bit about how you think about that process of empowerment. How do we help create or inspire or nurture the kinds of truth tellers rooted in experience, in authentic experiences, and people that are capable of doing power differently? What does it look like to support that cultural shift?
Well, I'll start, I guess. I want to go back to this issue of context, because I think one of the ways that we do that, and I'm now talking directly to Marta's question, is to create a safe space. And that's what we have been doing with our online courses, with our webinars also. But our courses have really brought out the stories of women, the values that we share of supporting and enhancing life rather than controlling and really taking life. And I think that for us as women, we need to create that safe space, not only in an online course or in a center or in a press, but in society at large. So the work that we're doing here, and my work, has really always focused on two things when we're talking about gender. One, that when we talk about gender, we're talking about what it means to be human, because there are two forms of humanity physically, the female form and the male form. With, the roles are something very blurred, but the forms are more or less there. And the matter of gender is something that women really have to start talking about, because the construction of gender roles and relations in domination systems is central to the whole system and makes the whole system unsafe. It's a way of children's brains being imprinted before their critical faculties are formed, in which difference is equated with either superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving, and that then applies to a different race, different religion. You know, it can be Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia. It can be white versus black or black versus white. It doesn't matter, difference. And our leadership really is about something else. It's about changing the social values and the social institutions so that, yes, they are a safe place for all of us, women and men, to fully express our humanity. Because as it stands now with the stereotypical dominator gender stereotypes, both men and women are robbed of their full humanity. Men can't be caring or they're sissies. Women can't be assertive or they're ball breakers. I mean, the whole thing is insane. And we have an opportunity now because between the Me Too movement, between these hearings, finally, gender is a platform. And I want you to think about broadening that platform to start talking about the intersections, the interconnections, and what the construction of gender really has to say about what kind of world we leave to our children and our grandchildren.
Carla or Jamia, do you want to connect?
How about Jamia?
I'm pondering. I'm thinking about, you know, when you were talking about the next generation, I think that is just sitting with me that Rihanna is saying that it spreads across generations. And so I'm pondering that and I'm thinking about that right now, about how important it is, right, that the actions, deeds, the ways in which we're engaging in partnership, that those are not in isolation as it relates to how we talk about gender, how we experience it. I'm thinking about the reality of how many young people I have even in the class. I teach one class a week at John Jay, and I have undergrads, freshmen, and how many people self-identify with different gender expressions publicly in the classes, who talk about their identities openly, and with a kind of very, very, very self-aware, but also ease around discussing these identities that I think feels even different from my own experiences. And I, you know, was born in 1980. And so there was already kind of a lot of different social movement around how we were talking about these issues. And so I'm just really interested in the next generation and how I do think that despite what we're seeing right now in our culture and what we're seeing in a lot of the different very serious political and social issues that we're dealing with, that there is a new generation that that they are learning from transformation work and seeds that have been planted about a new way of being, and they are embodying it, and they are doing that in the ways in which they see the issues, they talk about the issues, and show up as activists. And so I was really struck by what Rianne said about the generational piece, because just like trauma is epigenetic and it is passed down, I also think that uplift is done the same. I was raised by civil rights activists who grew up in Jim Crow. My mom was raised by family members who were fighting for voter registration rights in the South, risking their lives to do that, and had crosses burnt on their lawns for just wanting to be free. And all of that same sort of, the trauma is also passed down, but then also that same sort of sense of inherent dignity, reciprocity, interdependence, giving back, that kind of resilience, that is passed down. I have learned partnership from those people who came before me, right? I've learned that there's a different way, and a lot of people aren't practicing the way that we think is a different way, but it's still righteous to fight for that. Is something that I always just kind of felt in my bones because it was what I was taught. So I just was really struck by that and thinking about that as it applies to the work, and also how we see and talk about our role in it from a gender perspective, but then also broader.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like, I mean, just, it's so striking to think about this historically grounded, bigger timelines thinking both in terms of longer term visions of the past and also how that, forward into multiple generations of the future is itself part of partnership leadership, is operating from a place of that kind of awareness out, and not in the sort of short term immediate gratification kinds of focal points that that domination leadership tends to orient to. But Carla,
I think the way that you just summarized that, so much of that has to do with the capacity to understand systems, right? And to understand the arc of history and the different relationships between people, the nature, all of those things. So one of the things I want to draw on in answer to that great question, like what does it look like? When we talk about science, and Rianne in her opening comments talked about the way that the scientists kind of created a narrative that justified and absented women from it. And what you see now with feminist scientists and the feminist publication of scientists thinking about how the world works from a different point of view is you have a new emerging scientific narrative and explanation for what is really the operating system of the universe, like what's going on here. And one of the feminist scientists whose work I draw a lot of hope and excitement from is Janine Benius, who is the founder of something called biomimicry, which is really looking at the way that nature operates in order to learn about ourselves, since we are nature. We like to forget that we're part of nature, and we work very hard to pull ourselves aside, but we are nature. So what are some of the ways of looking at nature that can instruct us in the kind of leadership that's needed now? And what Janine says is you really need to take an organism perspective. And she scopes way back, like looking, if the Earth came into existence around 4.5 billion years ago or so, what lessons can we take from the organisms that have survived and thrived on planet Earth? Because lots and lots of organisms just come and go and don't stick around. And so what's extractable when you look at, well, which organisms have really figured this out? And the ones that have been successful are the ones that create, what she says, create conditions conducive for life. Create conditions conducive for life. And when you look at it, when she's looked at it, and other scientists, feminist scientists have looked at it, they've come up with a short list of the conditions that are conducive for life. And that list is cooperation, diversity, generosity, and being networked. And that in some ways, this little 5,000-year sidebar that Brienne referenced in the opening comments, like if you look at the arc of the 200,000 years that human beings have been around in our modern form, and we've got this little detour, this 5,000-year patriarchy detour, where we're under the narrative and the operating of dominance, we have made a wrong turn. And the species, the organism, human being, needs to learn from that and reverse, U-turn, go back, and this really is the way that human beings learn, by mistake. It's a built-in learning part of our navigation. But what I take, like from an optimistic point of view, if I think, wow, 200,000 years, we took this 5,000-year detour, wrong turn, and look, we have the leaders, amazing leadership of Black Lives Matter, of the Me Too movement, the teenagers, the young kids saying, no, we won't have guns in the schools. So we have this uprising now saying, this is a wrong turn. We must reverse course, and we need to create the conditions that are conducive for life, which include cooperation, diversity, generosity, and being networked. And so that's sort of the core value set and skill set for leadership that can, I believe that leaders who are in the partnership model are people who can create conditions conducive to life and conducive to others being able to bring, as Jamia said earlier, bring it forward in their strengths, their gifts, their vulnerabilities, and in a safe way. That's, leaders create these conditions conducive to partnership.
That's so beautiful. And it answers really one of the first questions that I was going to bring forward, which was to sort of a question from the chat about sort of seeking a definition of partnership leadership that is something other than just not domination leadership. And I think you've just really powerfully expressed a definition. Are there other things, Rian or Jamia, that you would want to add to a definition of partnership leadership?
Well, I want to add a lot of things, but as I was listening to both Carla and to Jamia and to you, Sarah, I again wanted to go back to this whole systems perspective, because that is really, women have a larger corpus callosum. It's very interesting, that connects our right and left hemispheres on the average than men. Okay, I mean, that happened in the course of evolution, and goodness knows why. But it does make us more able to see the whole picture once we can breathe. Because a lot of women are very terrorized and conditioned to support really horrible systems and the whole 9 yards that we've been talking about. But I want to give some signs of hope here. If you look at the whole arc of history, you see something that I bring out with my co-author in the new book that is coming out with Oxford University Press, which is Nurturing Our Humanity, which is actually, we are beginning to have the building blocks for a completely different narrative. But they have only recently begun to emerge. My work really emphasizes the importance of gender relations and parent-child relations in what kind of society we build. And think about it, gender studies only appeared on the scene just a microsecond ago in time. The study of child development, again, the neuroscience, it is brand new in terms of the span of scientific history. So we now, as women, I think, really need to understand these areas, understand their recency, and bring them to the fore. Both women's studies, men's studies, and gender studies, both very much child development, which is huge. I mean, I'm so glad, Jamia, that you picked up on that, because we are talking about what's transmitted from generation to generation here. And if we're going to have lasting, solid foundations, it's no coincidence, by the way, that the people trying to push us back towards a more rigid domination system, the leaders of those movements, whether they're secular, like our current president, or whether they're religious, like so-called religious fundamentalists, which are really domination fundamentalists, that for them a top priority is always a return to the, quote, traditional family, which is a code, isn't it, for a rigidly male-dominated family where women are subservient, where the feminine is subservient, and where children learn early on, a punitive family, where they learn early on that it's very painful to question authority, no matter how bizarre, no matter how unjust. And we have to tackle these basics. This is something that I really hope women leaders can focus on. And we have to change the conversation. The narratives in the conventional conversation are still so superficial. They don't go to the basics. So it's up to us to change it.
Jamia, did you want to add anything to this sort of definition of partnership leadership that we're building here?
Yeah, I think everything that was said just resonates with me. I think what I'm thinking about a lot now, just being in these different spaces I'm in around activist spaces and things that are emerging this week that are going to happen. And having to understand that there's a specific sort of athleticism that is required when you are going to actively be in partnership, when you're actively going to be a co-conspirator. I know that word sometimes triggers attorneys, so what I mean is to be more than an ally, to actually be in it. I've had attorneys hear me say it and say, oh, don't use that word, but you know what I mean, to actively be in full partnership where you're not just kind of like, oh, I support you from afar, but you're putting your body on the line, you are putting your spirit in it, you're invested. And so for me, when I do think about the definition for when I am looking for people that I'm really going to be in partnership, is true investment and commitment, and that the athleticism of exercising the muscles of listening deeply, being accountable, taking ownership, failing well, making mistakes with humility, and being able to bounce back with service to the mission and to the process as being important. And I think that's just, that's just what I am seeking right now in myself and in others. I've been on a thread for an activist thing that's happening recently, and sometimes people will have a different approach or a different communication style. And there will be a part of myself that'll say, oh, this is feeling athletic. My lower back is feeling like it's sitting up because I'm being asked to stretch my way of seeing things or doing things or understanding things. But ultimately, I grow because of it, even if the final outcome isn't the way that I want, and to just still stay in it and not take one's toys and go home when the partnership model goes against our sensibilities of feeling comfortable. That's actually where you grow, right? And so the definition part for me is I actually would want it to be a verb, like the partnership as a verb, because I think that when you're engaged in true partnership, it is not something that is in a place of stasis or stagnation, that it is athletic. And so I feel like I've been getting a lot of cardio in the last couple of months, but I really wanted to say that it truly has to be a verb, I think, for it to be effective and for the transformation to happen.
Could I add to?
Please.
I love that list, Jamia. I just love that list, and I love the metaphors of the athletic, and that it's not easy. That's not some cooperation, kumbaya. We're just all going to hold hands and get along. It's actually, the development of the kind of courage it takes to listen to somebody else and to stay still and to stay in it. And so I want to talk about a skill set that we've been teaching here, which is really the inner warrior skill set. And it's the capacity to meditate, to listen to the wisdom that's in your body, to learn to be open to the mysterious and get outside of the knowing or not knowing. And these things, the skill sets that we're all listing, I think, are mobilized by, enabled by self-development, this inner strength that one can grow by finding the same way that we look at the landscape outside. There's the yard, there's a tree, there's a house, really getting familiar with what's going on inside, which you can't do if you're not quiet enough, if you don't gain some contemplative skills. You can't understand what's happening in your inner landscape, and then you can't interrupt it. You can't sort out, when am I operating in an adaptive mode because my fear brain is taking over or my ego is taking over, versus if you can create the space within yourself so that you can recognize, oh, I'm being triggered right now by the legacy of my family or by the history of my relationships or by whatever the context is, and therefore I'm in reactivity. And I've got to find a way out of reactivity. This is one of, I think, the central capacities to move from a domination model to a partnership model, is the ability to control one's reactivity, because it's that fear brain, that primitive flight or fight thing that happens that so often leads to domination. I have to power over somebody because I'm scared. I'm fundamentally afraid. And when you just boil it down to the nub, it's like, can I operate from a place of love? Not a saccharine love, not a like boyfriend, girlfriend, sex love, but from that deep place of revering what it means to be alive, to be a human, to be spiritually connected to each other. And in order to do that, we have to really understand our own internal landscape. So essential skills that we teach are some kind of contemplative practice, some kind of embodiment practice, understanding how to listen to the signals of your body about what's really going on and happening to you. And also really being able to recognize and understand power dynamics within yourself. What has been your power journey? What has been your own walk? Where is it that you have privilege in the world? Where do you not have privilege in the world? Can you be conscious and alert to the power dynamics at play at any given moment and catch yourself when you're powering over rather than powering with or powering to?
Mm-hmm. Rian, did you want to add something to this thread around the skills necessary for partnership leadership?
Well, my first thought is courage. Because, look, we are challenging. And I want to be very personal here. I had a model of what I call spiritual courage when I was a little girl in Vienna on Kristallnacht, when a gang of Nazis stormed into our home and dragged my father off. And it was the spiritual courage of my mother, who could have been killed. A lot of Jewish people were killed that night for standing up. But she stood up to these men, and she recognized one of them as a former errand boy in the family business, and she got furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man who was so kind to you?" Now, that is the courage to stand up for justice out of love. That is a skill that we all have. That is part of our, quote, human nature. But in terms of more practical applications of that skill, there's nothing like practice, like getting out there and speaking. I mean, in our courses, we have presentations where people can present. And for some people, that's really nerve-wracking because they've never done it before. But once they do, they feel wonderful because they are doing it. I cannot say how critical it is for us to make our voices heard at this moment in history and change the conversation. We have to change the conversation. And that requires actually immersing yourself in studying a whole different frame rather than left, right, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. Because if you think about it, there have been oppressive and violent regimes, whether it was Hitler in Germany or Kim Jong-un in North Korea, whether it's so-called religious fundamentalism here or in the East. Is it domination or is it partnership? And partnership, and I really love what you said, it isn't just being come by you and it isn't just being nice. We're talking about building a certain kind of social system in families, in wherever we happen to be, in a business, in a society. It is the skill to see what are the foundations for partnership, which is what really this work is all about, that we're doing. And yes, childhood and gender and economics, a whole new caring economics, and new language, new stories, new narratives. Those are the foundations. Everything else comes from it. So we're talking about both the acquiring of the inner strength of the courage, what really Carla was talking about, and of the nimbleness that Jamia was talking about, the athleticism, if you will. But we're also talking about grounding ourselves in a different worldview. Because for real change, as Einstein said, you cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. So this is the challenge to us. Get away from the old categories. Think of the struggle for our future is really, whether it's in the East or West or North or South, in a socialist or a capitalist nation, it's secular or religious, it's between a partnership way of life and a domination social system. And the way of life and the system are integrally interconnected. It's about that safe environment.
Mhm.
Can I just make one comment on
Sure.
that?
Oh, please.
Because I love just the clarity of that, Rianne, and I think there's a metaphor that comes out of this science basis that I love, which is called the Wood Wide Web. And the Wood Wide Web is, they have learned now that 90% of all land plants are connected by mushroom filaments. So you just scratch down on the earth a little bit, you can find a mushroom fiber that is connecting all of the plants to each other and to water and to nutrients. And they've been able to tag nutrients at the microscopic level and figure out what's going on. And what is going on is that this web, this wood wide web, there's massive amounts of communication. There are warning signals, there are cooperation. All of these conditions conducive to life can be seen in this web. And you will see, for example, a large tree that has access to the sun will actually take the nutrients from the sun that it has access to, process it through its roots, share it with a bush, another species that's in the shade and has no access. Plants that have a big root system will hold on to water for neighboring plants that don't have root systems. And so you can actually watch the vibrant level of cooperation, diversity, generosity, and networking that is going on. And if that is truly the pulse of nature, and it's not to say there's no competition, it's not to say that animals don't eat animals and that there isn't, proof in the universe of domination, but what science really is starting to show us now is that the dominant operating system of the universe is cooperation, is partnership. So we human beings better get on with it. If we want our organism, this miraculous organism, to stick around.
I love that you bring this out because, again, it is the new science that I'm talking about, the new paradigm that we have to build, the new narrative that we have to build. And when I found out about the trees being connected, I mean, wow. But see, most of science is still very siloed. They don't know about this. So it's up to us to, again, connect the different siloed parts of the university. I mean, it's a huge job, but I want to say something here. Forgive me for taking the moment, but it's an exciting moment in science as well as in society. And it's not coincidental. We're getting some of the raw material we need to construct a different narrative that shows that partnership is not only possible, but that it is much better. And societies really that orient more to partnership, like the Nordic nations, where women have much higher status, are more caring societies because the so-called feminine, right, rises in status as women rise in status. We have to understand these dynamics of gender and talk about them. Go out there, change the conversation, change the narrative. And the last thing I want to say, and then I'm really going to be quiet, is, and that refers to something Carla was talking about, we don't have to live in a world without property. The Nordic nations have property, and they certainly have a good agricultural system. This wasn't inevitable. There were other factors that enter into it. So it isn't like we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, throw out civilization, and go back to whatever it was. We are moving in a partnership direction. There are countries that are in the forefront of the movement towards that kind of social system. We need to know about them. We need to know that there is an alternative to both capitalism and socialism, what I call a caring economics that gives visibility and value to the work of caring for people starting in early childhood, which and caring for our Mother Earth, which neither Marx nor Smith acknowledged as part of their theory. We're really reinventing ourselves, aren't we? And that's so exciting for us as women and men who are leading the partnership movement.
So I feel like we've been doing this beautiful work of sort of elaborating on the kind of athleticism, the kind of skill sets that are required for partnership leadership and for forging this new world, using the new raw materials that are available to us. And I think that I want to speak to or bring forward Donna Boris's comments from the chat, which relate to a different kind of courage, a different kind of athleticism, perhaps, required to be doing that work while also still in the presence of domination, of domination systems, which don't just go away because we think they should, right? And so Donna says in the chat that she says, today I'm feeling enraged and powerless in the face of what has been happening with the Kavanaugh nomination and Trump's mocking of Dr. Ford's testimony and other disgusting comments being made by Republican men last night and this morning. She says, it seems like the domination model of power is winning. So this is sort of this other face of this work. It's to do things differently, but also in awareness of the presence of the old, right? I have heard, I'm so furious I can barely speak. I have heard similar comments from other women this morning. The mocking comments mocked us all. She says, continuing to make calls and voting doesn't seem to be enough. It seems like we're being treated like bothersome gnats to be brushed aside as the men in Congress continue to, quote, plow their way forward. Any comments or inputs on how to move forward? I'm struggling with how to express power with and power through in a way that's effective. She says, it seems the men in power are laughing at us now. So how do we, what would you like to offer to Doris?
I'm going to defer to the two other panelists because I took longer last time. But the one thing I want to say very quickly, this is a long-term enterprise. This isn't going to happen overnight. And sure, these guys are so trapped. For them, there are only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. It goes back to their childhood, goes back to their, to what they have internalized as the human story. Our task is to show the benefits. Nations that have partnership are the happiest nations in the world. Nordic nations are always at the front of things. It's a different narrative we're telling. We may or may not prevail in this battle about Kavanaugh, but as Dylan said, things are changing, and it's up to us to really accelerate the pace of change, but not to expect it to happen tomorrow.
Yes, I mean, I think that so many of us share the feeling that you are expressing. And I think that one of the things that I hold close in my heart right now is that there's certain things that we have the power to control and to seize our own sense of righteousness and the power to maintain our own sense of joy. That was the first thing I said at our gala last night was, we are here celebrating tonight and we're going to be back to the work tomorrow, but they can never steal our joy, because the minute that you give away your joy, your laughter, your freedom, the parts of what it means to be human, it makes it a lot harder to come back to center. And so I would say, get into community. that's being in community is really important when you're having those feelings. Get into community with people who lift you up, who make you feel supported and strong, and who you see your own passion reflected in, and who will also hold you when it feels like it's too much, and you will in turn hold them. I also think it's really important to take the time you need to just be and release and experience your feelings, but also to heal. We all need to fortify ourselves for the long game, like what Rianne was saying, that we have a long game here. So there's no shame in taking the time you need to just take care of your body, your mind, and your spirit. I know for myself, I've already scheduled a couple of days this week, some blocks of time where I'm just going to sit down and read some really good books and take my mind off of the maelstrom of things that I'm constantly worried about, because it's important for us to actually practice self-care so we can be strong for that long haul. And then I think it's also really important to understand that the anger you're feeling is righteous. So I think that the idea of partnership or collaboration doesn't mean that we do not have righteous anger. And I think that that's something that I have had to really explore for myself, because I think that anger, especially when it's embodied in a Black woman's body, is internalized by so many people as dangerous. The things that I think make me the best version of who I am are things that people will see as threatening, because I have a real strong sense of dignity. I have a strong sense of my birthright to belong anywhere that I want to be, and people don't really always like seeing that in this body. And so for me, it's also kind of a reminder that it's not me who is in a delusion. It's not me who has something wrong because other people have a problem with me sort of stating that I'm powerful or that the system isn't working. It's the system that's the problem, and the people who are kind of perpetuating that just don't understand that yet. So I would say that the feelings you have are completely natural and normal, and just getting in community with other people who get that and who will support you, and to lose any sense of shame or fear that having those feelings is a bad thing. Because in fact, I think the fact that so many women are angry right now is in real good service to justice happening. That the Women's March happened because of a collective sense of justice and also transformative anger that was about partnership. And I think that that's really important. I keep reminding myself now of, thinking in my own spiritual path, like, oh, this is the moment when the Most High flipped the tables. That right now, this is a moment to flip the tables, that what is righteous to me is to say, oh, this must stop, that there's catastrophe that's going to happen if we don't go into another way, and that's going to get people's attention. And that doesn't have to be done in a violent way. Sometimes the anger is just about speaking truth to power and being the one to say the thing that makes other people afraid, and to take your righteous place, and to do what many truth tellers have done before us, which is to be the one who does the courageous, bold thing to be the first one to speak, so that others would be less afraid, and that the contagion of that courage would spread and become infectious, and then translate into transformation. So I'm really excited that you're fired up, because I think a lot of times when women do get fired up, we see things change, and that's why I think more of us should be in charge. But that's another conversation.
I love that. Can I add?
Please, yes.
A comment? There's a Buddhist woman, and I apologize for not remembering her name, but she did this piece of writing on the word courage, and the difference between that courage is rage plus love. And the difference between raw rage, where love is not in play, brings you to reactivity, but rage that is contained within that sense of love brings with it that hair of difference, between mimicking what is making us so outraged to begin with, right? We don't want to meet that repugnant, hateful behavior with the same thing. We want to transform it. And so it's that ingredient of love that doesn't negate the rage. It lets us have our rage. I love what you're saying, Jamia. We need that rage. We need to feel it. We need to understand it. But if we can add that ingredient, and the way that we learn how to add that ingredient, I think, is through that contemplative practice. So you can really cultivate a loving awareness, and you bring that to your rage. You can enter the fray from a slightly different perspective, which can change everything. And I think what we have seen, I just saw the new Michael Moore movie, Fahrenheit 11/9. And one of the things, this is not a movie review, but one of the things I think that was very effective for me was him showing footage of collective action and how profound collective action is. The Women's March, like, we forget it happened. We forget it happened, or yeah, it kind of happened, and well, it didn't matter because look where we are now. But it was amazing that many people came together on that kind of short notice. And now there's a new Women's March. It's just been scheduled for the 19th. The students organized this profound rallies. The teachers' unions, he has in there, I totally forgot. Do you remember when this one teacher's like, that's it, we're not doing it? And then boom, across the country, it was so, I love your word, Jamia, contagion, the contagion of courage. So I think feeling the rage, trying to hold it in love so that we're not meeting fire with fire, we're not meeting violence with violence, and connecting up in community so that you can relieve yourself, but also in collective action. There are collective actions happening everywhere. Somebody in my office today just said she wanted to take advantage of her, we give a day for civic action, and she said, I want to go to Washington. Can I go? I was like, yes, you can go. So, there is strength and momentum in putting yourself into the context of action with other people. So I think that's a very important part of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
I love your combination. It's what my mother exhibited. Her anger was really out of love. It's exactly what the spiritual courage, what I call spiritual courage, was and is.
Yeah, and cœur in French is heart.
Yes.
So C-O-U-R, cœur, heart, love plus rage equals courage. Yeah.
Well, I am seeing that we have just a few minutes left of our time together, and I want to, it's just a beautiful sort of place to sort of land around this definition of courage and this call for participation and voice and community and collective action. And also, I think, Jimmy, I'm just really struck by what you're saying about joy, and it ties for me to Rian's work on sacred pleasure, that there's a deep resistance in pleasure itself, right? That pleasure and joy are part of another way of being, which is what we're occupying, which is about love. But I wonder in our final moments, just if we could go around, and if you would like to sort of have a final reflection or a final word to share with folks on the call who are thinking about sort of walking back into the world that we're in today, with some additional nugget that you might want to share that you feel like is nice to have in our pockets as we move forward into the rest of this week or into the rest of our work in the healing and evolution of the world that we find ourselves in. Carla, why don't we start with you?
Oh, darn. Trying to come up with something really profound, but I can't.
Well,
I think
you don't need to top yourself.
No.
You've been profound.
No. I want to harken back to, we've all sort of said it, which is that it's a real roller coaster. Like Jamia, Rianne, you, we're all on this call today with the cameras on us, but every person on this call has the cameras on them, right? So like, we're on and then we're off. We're courageous and then we got fear. I don't know, did you wake up last night in the middle of the night with fear? I did, you know, and sort of this idea that we're going to be leaders and we're going to be leaders all the time, and, you know, that we're going to be strong all the time and courageous all the time and get it right all the time, I think is something that we need to scrap along with the domination model. You know, we need to embrace our vulnerability, understand the human experience is just fraught and filled with things we don't know and don't understand and can't know and can't understand. But that if we are guided and kind of create practices so that we keep a touchstone, we keep coming back to these core principles like aspirations. I aspire to be more loving. I aspire to be less power over. I aspire. And so we touch in with that aspiration and bring ourselves back from the edges that we inevitably go to just by virtue of being human. I think that is what I can leave you with today.
Thanks so much, Carla. That's very meaningful to me. I appreciate that. Jamia, how about you?
I think what's striking me as what is happening right now, and just thinking about partnership, is that so many of these systems of oppression that we have are really focused on exclusion, alienation, and isolation. That is what they do in terms of dominating people, making people question themselves, the gaslighting, you know, that happens. And so the one sentence that just kept coming to me for wanting people to have to take with them, and what I will remind myself throughout the rest of the week, is you are not alone. I am not alone. We are not alone. Last night, a lot of people were saying that the event we had together was just really uplifting because they'd been feeling the weight. And I was saying, wow, you know, we've got us, and that's a whole lot. That we are rich because we've got us. And although, you know, it is very scary to see abusers on the highest court of the land, you know, or people being possibly confirmed to being there, that those things are very real, and not to negate that those things are happening, but that there are so many people who are lovers and healers who are working to change that, right? And so I think sometimes we give heft to these systems and structures because for societal history reasons and all the things Rianne was talking about and Carla said, that we kind of assign a certain level of power to these systems. But Martin Luther King used to always tell us that some of the unjust laws needed to be opposed because those laws were not righteous and they weren't just in the higher order, right? And so that is something that I take with myself. Oh, you are not alone. You are not alone in thinking that this does not work. And there were many other people, even though on the news or in the government and other places, you see people who've been assigned these sort of arbitrary human powers, right? Or these like entitlements that they've been given over time, but in a higher order, it means nothing more than your own humanity. And when it gets in the way of your own humanity, that it is righteous to band with other people to change it. So that's what I'm keeping with me, is to know that I'm not alone. And even if I'm in a moment of isolation, alienation, or exclusion, that I'm carrying other people with me and also representing other people when I have moments when I can be brave. And I want everyone to know that we are not isolated and we are not alone and we are not stuck, that we have power to make decisions that can impact the next 100 years or more, and we can do them together.
Mm.
Well, I'm going to chime in at the very end.
Please.
To say this, we've been talking about courage, the courage to stand up against injustice out of love. I want to add to creativity to that. We are, as humans, enormously creative. And our task as leaders, whether we're women or men, right now, in this moment of history, is to create a new narrative, a new story, a new language that describes a partnership future. And we need to understand that one of the foundations of that future is childhood. Another foundation is gender. A third foundation is economics. We have to change the rules of the economic game so that the so-called women's work of caring for people And yes, keeping a clean environment is recognized for what it is, not just reproductive, but the most productive work. And back again to the story, to the narrative, and really a different story about ourselves, that we are powerful, that every one of you is powerful. You have the power of the chalice, the power to give, nurture, and illuminate life.
Thank you so much, Rian and Jamia and Carla, for sharing all of your, or so much of your wisdom and presence, loving presence with us today. And I want to also thank Ann Amberg, who is without whom this webinar would not have been possible, and who has been so beautifully present in the chat with all of you today. And Ann will be sending a follow-up email to those of you who registered and couldn't attend, and those who are here. You'll have a link to the recording of this session to share with others, and to watch again those parts that you want to really remember most dearly. And you'll also have other resources that we've prepared for you to kind of help take what inspiration you've gained from this conversation today into your work as you go forward in the world. So have courage, be well, and stay athletic. Keep your keep yourselves strong, and including your vulnerability. It's all part of this vision of strength and for our future. So thanks for being with us today, and we will hope that this is just the beginning of conversations yet to come. So thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for being with us, and bless you.
And to answer one question that's come up a couple times in the chat, we will share the chat as well. So you'll have all those links and wonderful comments. And thanks to those of you who have been summarizing as we go and like recapitulating some of the key phrases that really stood out to you. That will make our chat log just all the richer as a resource. So, all right, farewell.